Well, this is the very first episode of the first millennia. Yesterday we concluded 1,000 lectures in all the different subjects that we encounter, stretching over neurology, science of cognition, philosophy of science, ordinary philosophy, continental philosophy, quantum mechanics, theory of fractality, chaos theory, and even to such odd areas as audiology, the study of vision, the study of perceptual organs, our bodily balance. So it seems that the lecture's been stretching over many different areas, many different subjects. But I understand more and more it is in one single direction. And that direction actually grew more precise, more definitive for each added subject. We are gaining distinctiveness, precisiveness in the subject. Whereas would we stick to one single subject, we would dilute that subject. It would be, as we say in Swedish, spritt, spread, attenuated. It would not be as clear. And this is the most important message coming both from fractality, Jacques Derrida, Rodolphe Gasquet explains this very clearly. As soon as you start to isolate, you become blurry, you become hazy, you become unclear, unintellectual. You are doing the simple thing by thinking by division and exclusion. You will gain clarity. You gain the absolute opposite. And I would say the importance of being true comes in the level of our acquirement of our inner and outer self. Without the making of the inner, or that the inner is working to perfection, and that our mind and the thinking processes, all the different thinking processes, become more and more anti-fragile, as Naib Talib calls it, and more permanent. There will be more and more preciseness, acuteness, discreteness, and universality and generality. That is the deconstructive message, that partitioning hurts the thing. You partition everything, you become blurry, hazy, unclear, even gaggling, as Rodolphe Gasquet says. But you can gain both the global take, the possibility of being reflective on the big scale, as well as you gain in the small scale, because they are a reflection of each other. And this is, oddly enough, very similar to in some aspect, to the relationship between body and soul. Once the body is defined, it becomes something different, and it ceases to be close to the soul. But as you encompass the body, let it be part of the whole, it can also be a corporal body. It can be what it is. It is then allowed to be of flesh, which is something is impossible if you divide it beforehand. And the subject for today is how we make ourselves more resilient when we start to investigate our inner workings, our thinking processes, the sharpening of our minds. There was a scientist I think he had a book in Popular Science somewhere in the early 90s or late 80s. He wrote a book about the different intellects or the different selves. And he came to the conclusion there were at least 12 different thinking, more or less isolated, functioning within the mind. It was most interesting. I would try to find his name. It's ages since I read him. I remember him now actually when I read these lines. But it's a point to it. Many different traditions and cultures that are more into the workings of the mind, usually defined somewhere in between 6 to 20 different thinking modes. But one very important thing is that we perfect those things, that we make them better. Because if they are not permanent, if we divide preemptively, we make our awareness only to become something very, very momentarily. And this is this goldfish mentality that so much affects modern day, where we are no longer able to concentrate. It's a little bit like me Googling or going into YouTube. I saw my history the other day. First I saw a video for maybe 10 minutes, and then it was 8 minutes, and then every video was like 1 minute. And as always, I ended up looking at some weird language. This is dispersion of focus. This is dispersion of awareness. And we usually misdirect our awareness, and we spend the energy we have. Instead of using the energy to make our inner working stronger, we dilute them even before we have the chance to make them strong. Once they are strong, there is no problem. You can do whatever you want. But they need to be strengthened first. And since I would say in Western Hemisphere, no one goes into the inner workings. We haven't had the tools. We didn't even have an awareness of an inner life before quantum mechanics. That's a new thing, and it needs to be taken care of. And I would say it's a little bit like entering into a new continent. I call that new continent terra incognita before. It is like being Christopher Columbus and going on the Santa Maria and take off westwards from Cadiz, I think he left from, and see what you're going to find. And of course, the adventure he made was nothing short by miraculous. But I think if we first strengthen us in our direction by going outwards, and we do that repeating the verses, and I think outward is the best place to start, because there we already have some control of what we're doing. We can actually control our reactions outwards. I don't suddenly burst into laughter now, or having fits of angers. So I do have some control. Whereas to the inner workings, I think it's fair to assume there is no control whatsoever, because we haven't gone there yet, and we don't have any method of implying control or direction for our inner life. But of course, as chaos theory had been showing us, there is a strict possibility for that. We could do it. But then first, we need to strengthen our awareness. We need to make it as strong as possible so it can support a journey westwards. Just in the same manner as Christopher Columbus equipped his 3 boats, Santa Maria, Pinto, and the El Nino, for the journey, with food, water, clothes, gunpowder, and other things necessary for the trip. We need to equip ourselves for this interesting journey inwards, because the complexities we will encounter inwards are much, much greater, bigger than ever any complexity we can find on the outside. And by then I don't mean that the complexities by any level are any or simple. They're still incredibly complicated outside. But if we go inside, we are going to encounter, as I mentioned earlier, retention comes after pretension. And in retention, we will, as Bergson mentioned many times, find an ocean of things. And because of fractality and movement can store everything, potentially all things that ever happen is in that retention. But I would say it would be fair enough that at least 4 or 5 generations or a couple of millennia are there somehow. It is all stored in the movement. Fractality doesn't leave anything on memories. It doesn't have forgetfulness. But it's very, very important, let me get back to that again, to learn to have an awareness that stretches over time is of the utmost importance. Otherwise you will be driving a broken vehicle. Your instruments for perception, thinking, direction will be broken at the very outset. And that will be the same thing as leaving Spain with a broken compass. You will not be able to find your way westwards. So you need to establish the compass of awareness over time. And this is something Dan Ariely pointed out so well in his research project and also his referring projects. We don't have any awareness. In modern time and age, awareness is a very, very rare thing. It lasts something in the vicinity of 20 to 30 seconds. I think it's an educated guess to say that it was at least 5 minutes only 100 years ago. Otherwise, we wouldn't have survived. It is a complete disaster for the survival mechanism not to have an awareness that stretches over time. It means that our decisions are going to be momentarily based on momentarily information that I gather in the instant, and that will not be enough to make an eloquent and careful readout of the world. And this of course goes hand in hand once more with Jacques Derrida and his careful reading. He was able to do that. He was complex enough. And I watched yesterday in the discussions between John Searle and Jacques Derrida, and it's obvious that Jacques Derrida is much more composed. His voice sounds better than John Searle. He sits better, he's more balanced, and he doesn't react preemptively, whereas John Searle in the end, especially one of the dialogues, he just like lashes out with a saber like this from an emotional standpoint, and it looks actually really, really bad. And this is actually one of the reasons, oddly enough, that he gained popularity in the Anglo-American world, was actually because of one of these happenings, because this was broadcast not on prime time in the US, but it was still sent over PBS, and his demeanor was actually the selling point. That's why he became popular in the United States. He seemed so calm, so composed, and so thoughtful. I bet you the rest of what he was saying didn't attract him in the beginning. I wasn't attracted by Derrida myself either, because I wasn't ready for him. And I have to take it like this, what we call is välling in Swedish. This is what we give small kids who cannot support proper food. And it's a sort of diluted porridge made from oats. I had to take it in an analytical fashion. I actually read Derrida from a doctorate at Gothenburg University, who made a doctoral thesis about Derrida, claiming him actually to be an analytical philosopher. I'm happy for that. I read it because I wouldn't have been able to reach out to Derrida. So I'm really thankful for that person. And I don't know if it's possible for me to find out who he was and what was his name. because this is before computerization. Well, we can discuss that afterwards, but it will be quite interesting. I'm digressing, sorry, but Rodolphe Gachet also points out one of the reasons we misread text, or better explained, or better put, we read in a clumsy and simplified way, is that we are not composed enough, we're not integrated enough, we're not wholes that read a whole. And he's always pointing to holism. And this is actually something pointed out by Jordan Peterson as well. This Canadian professor is well aware that there is a disaster when it comes to focus today in the schools and also in general by the public. I do not agree, however, with his advices. Some of them are good, some of them are just too measly weasley to make any point. I think one of his advice is do make your bed. Well, I think that's more or less obvious, but does it help you to be focused? Maybe a little, but it doesn't. It's not the thing that's going to turn the table completely. But it's good in a way, because he's very good in mentioning how ADHD, lack of focus, OCD is actually lack of focus. Why is that? Well, it's because if you don't have any inner control, any thought that comes up cannot be handled with. And therefore it can by itself grow strong. And in the end it could turn out as an OCD. And that OCD could be anything. And I can testify having the same experience. This happened like 20 years ago. I passed through the big mall here in my hometown, Gothenburg, and when I passed there was a big sound, and one of these security guards come rushing for me and asked me to open my bag. It turned out I didn't steal anything. One of the library books had a magnetic strip, and since this was the beginning of this technology, they couldn't discern one from the other. And I didn't think much of it, and I think months went past. Then all of a sudden, must have been 4 or 5 months later, I did notice every time I passed those magnetic security systems when exiting a store, I tensed. I wasn't even aware of it. And I had no idea I was afraid of being accused of thievery or such a thing. Of course, I'm not to a high degree, but these things are dangerous. Left alone, they can develop to whatever, and you have no control. And the randomness of it, that shocked me, because it could have been anything that would have started. It could be a certain fright of I don't know, bees or grass or something. OCDs can turn up anyway. They are completely random, and that scared me even more, because I had the idea that there has to be some trauma lying under, or something to do with education or how you grew up. No, anything can turn up, and that's scary, more scary than anything else. So there is this lack of control is in itself a big problem nowadays. And Dan Ariely says that in Israel, where most of his research is done, all sorts of weird OCDs are turning up. And I listened to the radio a couple of years ago, and it was actually this person who was afraid of office plants. So anything can happen. Anything is potentially possible. And imagine you get afraid of something you really need, like water. You die. And actually, in some cases, OCD people do die because their OCDs are so harmful to themselves. Washing your hands can actually result in a dangerous infection if you do it like 30-40 times a day. That could kill you. You can actually cause blood poisoning by doing it. Although the intention was never there from the beginning. And now we are actually finding OCD in very, very young people, even almost pre-verbal state. And since this is spreading, I think the idea of going inwards and getting some control over the thinking system could be a good idea. A little bit like the movie The Runaway Train, which always scares me somehow. And I understand why it scares me. Because most people, me including, we don't have any control over our own minds. And I think Runaway Train is to some degree a metaphor for the runaway mind of today. Because it's a locked locomotive, it is going into the apocalypse quick, and they can't stop it. And of course, the passive consciousness is a contradiction in itself. And I want to add here something that popped up the other day, and this is the hard problem constructed by the Australian professor in philosophy, David Chalmers, somewhere in the 90s. When I read philosophy in 97 or 98, it was 3 whole lectures dedicated to this problem, and it turned out becoming even more and more important. But I think the very problem claimed by David Chalmers is part of the problem, and that is not understanding what is activity, what is direction. Let me take this in order. I'm going to divide this in 3 paragraphs to make it very clear, because this needs to be put down in the foundation to make a good head start, so you really are well off when you go out to your journey. You have everything established so you don't stray. It's very important. And this is something, of course, we ignore today. We don't think thinking has any role to play at all, and nothing can go wrong, or rather, we say that nothing can go wrong, but we constantly fear that everything will go wrong. And there is a really good reason to thinking the latter or feeling the latter. And most people that feel that will be in constant denial, something we learn from cognitive dissociation. And that is that human beings that are suffering from something will always deny it. And a famous example, I think I mentioned before, is the test that was made in the late 60s, and I think it was made at Berkeley University. And that is when one found out this with cognitive dissociation, proven at least 100 times after that, if not more. And they exposed 2 different groups to an experiment, so to speak. They were to put something together, a very, very tedious puzzle of sorts. Not complicated, very easy, and they were asked to do it over and over again. So the whole process was extraordinarily boring, and they had to spend 2 hours with this. And afterwards, one of the group was given for the job $1, whereas the other group was given $20. And $20 at the time was quite a lot of money, whereas $1 was very little. And then they asked the groups to describe the chore, what they had done, what did they feel about it, how was the experiment, did you think it was interesting, and do you think this experiment could actually lead science in a good direction, could the results be useful? The first group responded, this was the most interesting experiment, and I hugely enjoyed the experiment. It was a fantastic time, and I'm really glad to spending this time helping out science. Then they asked the second group. Remember, this has been redone a lot of times. When I say 100, it could even be more. Then they asked the second group, who was rewarded with $20, a significant sum of money. The absolute majority told the truth. It was a boring, nonsensical experiment that couldn't lead to anything. And this was how the experiment was constructed. Everybody could see it was nonsensical. That was made of the experiment. It was made that way. But only the ones apparently who got $20 could be honest with themselves. What they have done during these 2 hours. Because they got the $20. So they could be honest with themselves. I got the $20, I can be honest. But that could not happen with the ones who got $1. They had to explain to themselves what they had been doing there for 2 hours. And this is proven always to be the case in human interaction, in human doings. When it's boring, when it doesn't have a direction, we always use cognitive dissonance. And this is what happens today. When we are most persistent to say that we have a direction, we understand things, we are happy with the knowledge we have, we all lie about that. And this is something proven by so many research projects. It's scary. It actually scared me in the beginning when I first heard it in '98 when I studied science of cognition. But let's cut to the chase and go into the first paragraph here. First, we must start from an exogenous take. We need to progress our possibility and our ability to have a strange attractor. That needs to be repeated, and it needs to be firmly established. It needs to be learned by heart, and it needs to be so habitual. It will be as common, known to you, like your own heartbeat, because what this is going to be is a heartbeat of your whole system. And you will notice after a while that the repetition enters both in your thinking process and in your body. I think it took me like 6 or 7 months before I realized that. And I was lying in my bed, I was doing the repetition because I was woken up. And it was way too early, and I was thinking, oh no, I had to wake up. And then I thought, let's do the verses. And before long, I felt myself relaxing. And within a rather short time span, I was sleeping once more. And I was completely amazed before. It never happened to me before. And then it was repeated 2 days later, and then repeated, and then repeated. I repeated that same thing at least 200-300 times since that. Every time I do it, I fall asleep again. I relax. And then I understood this is pretty powerful, because nothing else could make me fall asleep again. No tea, no honey and tea, no whiskey, no soothing thoughts of lambs jumping over a fence or anything like that. But this did the trick. And then I felt it in my body. I felt it when I did exercises, that I balanced up. All of a sudden, oddly enough, although the whole thing was, I thought, just the thinking thing. How could that affect my body or reality? Well, it did. And this is how we learn to understand reality. We do thinking, and then we notice in the exogenous part of the world. This is how you have to start, because everyone trusts their eyes. Start with that. We already have a trust. When I wiggle this branch in front of you, you will all say, this branch has red leaves, you will agree with me. So that's a good starting point. And so did I work. I agreed with myself, the verses are having an effect. Otherwise, the whole thing would be pure belief. Although I read about it, I know about it, that is simply not enough. I need to understand it, body and soul. And it became much stronger after that. And that goes beyond the proof. I do experience it. Do not forget that experience is the most powerful thing above everything else. It's a very strong indications from experience. And making it part of your experience will both make you more convinced, but more importantly, it will be able for you to put more intention without even wanting to put more intention. It will come naturally. Like you tasted something unnaturally sweet and good. I tried a new fruit a couple of weeks ago and I couldn't resist it. I had to buy more of it. It was called lychee. I don't know if you tried it. It's from China, but it's just absolutely delicious. And I don't need convincing to go buy more. Not at all. In the end, it was the price that stopped me from buying more. It was hugely expensive, but it was just beyond. It was like the fruits of heaven or something. If you haven't tried them, I do recommend lychee fruits, and I don't know if they're for sale now. They look weird, like ping pong balls, but dark. You open them up and inside there is not a very appetizing color, like bleak pink, but the taste, it's just marvelous. No acidity to speak of, but just fruitiness and grandeur. But that's how it works. Once you taste the fruit of pleasure, and this is pure pleasure coming from the body and the mind, you will be much more motivated naturally. And this is a natural motivation. It doesn't take strength in the same way as it did in the beginning. So do trust the process to continue, because the more you struggle on, the less you have to put in of yourself into it, because your whole body gets acquired wanting more of this, wanting more of balance, because every aspect of your life gets improved. And this is the happy message of Rodolphe Gasquet. Once you open up, take in everything, broaden your perspective, that is the time you can have distinctiveness, exactness, specificness. This is when you can be that neurosurgeon that makes a cut that is 1/4 of 10th millimeter, which is actually possible. You can do the same with your intellect. If you let everything open up, you can gain that sharpness, which is very important. So once you acquire that, then starts the big journey going to your inside, the more interesting part, even more interesting part, I have to say. In the inside you can actually find something you haven't experienced before, if you move that a little bit. And that is your own inner self, who you are, and all your attention, all your memories. And this sort of already happened with our lecture series, because earlier I hadn't noticed that all the different lectures and all the reading, maybe 10 to 2 hours depending which lectures of study before, everything is resounding now. All is part of the fractality of the knowledge. Nothing is left outside, both specifically and generally. And I see now more and more how I can access this. And the access don't have to be conscious even. It is still there in my bodily / mind system. It is in there, in the fractality. And this is the great step to enter into that. Once your direction is clear enough, once you can repeat everything by a clockwork like a heartbeat, you're strong enough to go to the inside. And you can put awareness into spots that have been unaware before. And here comes in an important pointer here, and that's awareness is always activity. Awareness can in itself never ever be passivity. If there is an absolute contradiction, that would be absolutely close to it. But I don't think there are absolute contradictions, but they're as close as you can get. Every idea of a passive consciousness is sort of anti-consciousness, excuse me the term. But then I come to the idea of David Chalmers. He hypothesized a passive consciousness, a consciousness as an existence. And I think that meant that he himself had no access whatsoever to his inside. Otherwise he would have never claimed that. The second thing is the very idea that consciousness is some type of existence will make it much harder to reach into the inside, because you're already putting the idea of passivity into the picture. Once you get the idea of passivity, that's almost like telling the whole mental system to give up, or at least to take it very, very easy, take a siesta or something of the sort. No, here is something to build up, here is an intention to reach, and here is an incredibly interesting world to discover. The second paragraph is that the body that you will discover after you went into your inside is also a sort of chaotic system. It's also a balanced system. Although it's unbalanced now, when we talk, we don't care about it, we haven't cared about it, but that doesn't mean we couldn't care about it. We could get that balance, and it is always possible to gain balance. Chaotic systems are always turning up where there is a strange attractor. So continuing with the strange attractor will bring also the body into the action. So it's a little bit like the spiral of the Milky Way. More and more things get dragged into the picture, into the system, and your body will be the next one after your inner self to be dragged in, because its stability, its balance, its coordinate system is closely connected to the mind, and it's also connected to the outer worlds. We start with the outer world, go to our inner mind, and then we go to the body. And connection, we already know from neurology, is that obvious that our hearing system is in a way the same thing as balance, proprioception. Could also be seen as different. Can both make the division, hearing being different, but it's absolutely vital to understand hearing is so important for your balancing system, and you need to send all your senses around you. And I would say start with the hearing, because that is more neutral than your seeing. I think your seeing is more affected by this object idea, whereas your hearing is not. And therefore I had so great joy this morning. I actually walked about for a good 2 hours in a house I don't know very well, but by hearing I could directly feel now. So when I step, I hear them, I know the size of the room, and I also know how the room more or less is constructed, and I can hear where the furniture is. That is actually something that your body already knows. So the only thing that you need to is to tune into that knowledge you already have, and then you can access it. So we are not that different from bats. I don't know if you know about how bats orientate themselves, but they're not using their eyes, they are using their hearing, and that's why the ears of the bats are so incredibly large. They constitute a complete system for knowing everything, and they actually catch flies that are this size, the size of a banana fly. They can eat knots, that is knot in Swedish. And how that is possible without seeing is just beyond belief. This is what they do. And sometimes at night or very early morning you can hear their signals. They actually send out a very clear signal. I can't hear the signal of your ears, but you can hear the signal of the bat. It's very loud, and it took me a couple of years until I understood that that sound was actually an animal. It was just in the background. I think this is a good example how to explore the inner area. I was always somehow aware of the sound from the bats. Always been around me. But it was one day I became aware of it. That was different. I could look at it. I could sense it in a second way. I realized I'd always been hearing it, but I wasn't aware of it. And there was a difference between being non-aware, having the knowledge, and being aware and having the knowledge. It became clearer. And this is what awareness does. It's an action, it's a directedness. And everything became more interesting. Then I began to notice bats all over the place. And I travel to another town, I listen into the bats. I hear, oh, it's bats here. And I can even tell other people there are bats here, and they say, I don't think so. And after 5 to 10 minutes they can hear the bats. And that is the same as I'm suggesting with understanding your inner workings. To certain levels you have always been aware of it, but you haven't been aware of it with a big A. You have not been in control of it. There hasn't been a possibility of control of your thinking. It's been there. It is in your existence, and because you have not been able to control it, you haven't paid any attention to it, because there's nothing you can do anyway about it. That's a sort of giving up for one's inner doings. Because trust me, I notice I spend so much time with unnecessary thinking. Energy is lost that way, direction is lost that way, and sadly enough, human beings have the vicinity of 70 to 80,000 thoughts a day. The very majority in modern man are repetitions, going on every single day. There was actually a strophe from the one who inspired David Bradel. I think his name was St. John Smith. St. John Smith. He said something to the effect of the brain for normal people today is just sheer repetition. And what could be worse than having that? Something to that effect. I don't have the quote completely correct. I remember his name, Professor St. John Smith. And I started to feel that more and more. And I could possibly waste less energy in that, because most of that thinking is annoying to a certain degree. It's like friction. It's like scrubbing your hand over the blackboard in the school. It's friction, it's annoying. You heard it so many times. Maybe it's going on for 10, 20, 30 years, the same thoughts. You cannot do anything about them until you enter your inner life. And that means that you are bound to have maybe the equivalent of maybe 10 to 20% repetitive thoughts. And some of them are completely nonsensical. They don't make any sense whatsoever. The only thing I can find in the literature that compares to that is Vritti in the Samkhya philosophy. And that is stir up on the surface of consciousness. I don't think that's absolutely accurate, but that's my point of view, but I give it to you, Vritti's. But it's sort of the OCD, and it could be anything. You can have in storage in your mental storage room, which you never open, things that has nothing to do with you whatsoever. And since you never enter there, it will live its own life and enforce its own will. And then you have competing chaotic systems. And since you've given up the steering wheel, those can actually gain force, and they can become sturdy chaotic systems to some extent. And those sturdy chaotic systems are what OCD is. And they can turn up whatever. It could be washing your hands, it could be biting your fingernails, obsessing over food. I think that's an even better example. How many people today do not obsess over food? There are way too many. I can just tell you, yesterday somebody told me, I know that was going to happen. I was just thinking, now she's been allergic to lactose, she can't eat that, she can't eat this. And now yesterday she told me, I cannot take gluten anymore, and the doctor told me so. And I thought directly she convinced the doctor to tell her that by giving all the indications, producing the symptoms. We know we can produce symptoms just by will, and she was even given a medicine, and she told me it costed 1,000 crowns. And then I checked out the medicine, and I saw, yes, maybe it costed 1,000 crowns, but it wasn't a prescription. So she bought it herself. So I think that is very common, obsessing over food. A lot of people are obsessing over the environment. How many are not worried about waste and everything? And here in Sweden, when you put a tax, every plastic bag in Sweden has a tax. I think it's 6 crowns a plastic bag, despite the fact that they are made of biodecomposable material, despite that fact. And what are they worried about? Were they worried that Swedes would put a lot of plastic bags in the nature? I tell you, you haven't found plastic bags in Swedish nature for decennia, decades. To be honest, I think the tax should be put in China, where you have 1.3 billion Chinese putting plastic bags all over the place. So this is fretting, this is obsessing. It doesn't make any sense. And once you fret, you waste energy. And once you waste energy, you waste direction. And all of a sudden, my slightly preposterous idea that we could have a direction is not that weird. And it becomes now also clearer how we waste our energy in things we never intended to waste our energy on. And when I say you are completely unaware, let me just take this friend I met a couple of years ago. He was that sort of person who never washed his hands ever. Constantly dirty hands. He was a mechanic. And that guy, he went from constantly having black morose hands, too black that I wanted him to cook even. Now he's washing his hands 30 times a day. It just came from the blue. And this is also the case with diseases. I won't mention disease because I haven't looked into that. But I'm just going to make an association here. Because we know the system, the chaotic system, can produce symptoms. Of course it can produce actual diseases as well. Because diseases are chaotic systems. They are self-producing. They have a strange attractor. And this is what the immune system does. It has to be a stronger chaotic system. Because we found out the immune system is not a system in that way as we thought. We thought it had organs. We thought it, medicine thought the immune system to be sort of an existence. Well, not completely an existence, but in that way. And now we found out it's a complex. It's like the heartbeat. The heartbeat is not ruled by an internal system. It's almost ruled by itself, by something that is stronger than direction from the brain. And that is a chaotic system. That makes the heart unbeatable. That makes our body be able to run 42 kilometers to complete a marathon. That makes our body continuously pump blood to our hearts for 90, 100 years. That would never ever happen if it had to be connected to the brain computer only. That would miss a beat here and there. That would never be that sturdy. And you can even rip the heart out of your body and it will continue to beat for quite a while. That's the strongest thing. The chaotic system beats everything. And why should not the human body obey those laws or use those laws like the rest of the universe does? Well, there is no reason for that because it's simply not the case. The body, once it comes into action, it will strengthen all other aspects as I mentioned. It will strengthen the intellect. Because being out of your body, being in the reflective consciousness of Richard E. Lind, or why not my old professor Torbjörn Tännsjö, who obviously was a head without a body. Because his body always went one direction and his head another direction. And what he said was usually so alien to any perception of human right or wrong. It was like there was no laws in the universe. And this is the knowledge I gained from understanding there are actual laws and rules in the universe. And this is something that Stephen Rosen pointed out. The fear of the apparent is not just fear of the unknown. It is actually the fear of the ego, this construct we have instead of a self, to lose its control, to self-construct a world, to make its own fantasies, its own dreaming world, instead of living in a real world with proper rules that you have to obey, proper feature you can learn of and have knowledge of. Because as Rodolphe Gachet pointed out, and I mentioned that a lot of times now, that direct reflection doesn't give any knowledge. It's just a very, very simple take on self-identity. And a shut-off system doesn't gain knowledge. It can only rename or reconstitute the things that it already have. Almost like Barbara Tversky showed, that our system is working by decontextualization, and then you can recontextualize that decontextualized material. And that works fine, but if you don't have any exogenous part that you look out to, you will do it internally, and you will start feeding out of your own material. Rename those things you already learned, and not gaining anything new, inventing as you think new things, but it's the same old dream over and over again. This is the simulacry that Ian McGilchrist is talking about, how we self-construct our own world. And obviously we cut ourselves from the body, who is the only real contact we can have with a true exogenous world. And this is an exogenous world that you can learn from, investigate, be in contact with, have knowledge of, because it's a fractality. It's not a representational system that you make up in your own head. Who are the best representationalists? Well, obviously the schizophrenics, because everything in a schizophrenic refers to something inner in himself. And all schizophrenics are constantly right. Why? Because in a representational system you can always make it completely right. You don't need an externality. You don't need anything exogenous. And in that made-up world you can be king. You could be the king of Portugalian, as Selma Lagerlöf called. You can be the emperor of France. But the thing is, you are absolutely powerless in the real world. And this is where cognitive dissonance comes in once more. Because the lack of power you have in the real world, you make up for a huge ego. Because this ego just becomes stronger and stronger. And it demands more and more repetitive, monotonous fantasies of your own grandeur in a world you self-construct. And you stop somewhere on the way caring that you don't get any satisfaction, you don't get any joy, because that can only be given once you have knowledge. Knowledge is the feed of our souls. Knowledge is the true externality, it's the true radical otherness of Levinas. This is the true do of Martin Buber. This is what we are actually born into, the real world. And the real world has real features. And you need to learn to both obey them, and then you will discover it's much nicer to live in the real world, obeys the laws, because that could actually give you real control over your own thinking. And in the choice, being like my old professor, having no control whatsoever of your thinking and your body, what would you choose? Having an imagined world that only you can inhabit, and you could not even be understood to yourself, because you can't gain any knowledge in yourself, because you can't make yourself understood because of the private language argument from Wittgenstein, the Scarabee example. Actually a warning about schizophrenia. Oddly enough, Wittgenstein knew if you go too far on the private language idea, you will end up in schizophrenia, and you will have this really weird gaze that is looking for objects or representations of your own thinking, your own real thinking. What you will gain instead, once you take an interest in the real world, you will gain into the text you will be able to digest text again, and you will discover you can get deeper and deeper into texts, and you will discover an otherness in the text, and you will not feel scared of that otherness anymore. You don't have to put on polarities on it and say it's this or that preemptively. You don't have to be biased anymore, because bias is very connected to scare. We are scared today, as Ian McGilchrist point and many others. We are scared today, and therefore we put on a defense mechanism. This is so obvious. Our whole brain is constructed to fear. It's a fear-conditioned brain. And a fear-conditioned brain can't make any complex or deep conclusions about anything. And above all, it can't learn anything. It's absolutely impossible. And I think I would end off with one of these big research projects that Ian McGilchrist pointed out. Even after 10 years of education in 3 states in the United States, all that the students or pupils, I have to say, had gained was a new vocabulary. They had gained very little knowledge, and they lowered their IQ with a whole 8%, which is massive. It's way too much. And that's lowerage. That indication is telling of the modern time that's coming. We need to start understanding instead. We need to learn. There's nothing dangerous with learning the world. Although my old professor would say the opposite. Don't go outside yourself. You can make yourself true within without even reaching in within. Just put one equal sign in between another. That was the lesson of Dag Westerståhl. And he actually, I'm thankful to him, because he actually kicked me in the butt. Because what he said sounded so scary. I know I was on the wrong path. And that's when he said A equals A. It's true in itself, and you don't need a real world. It sounded too eerie to our ears. I end there and I say, have a very pleasant afternoon. And Kalle, please, yes?
Yeah, I want to compliment you on that insight from Wittgenstein of private language, and that can lead in turn to schizophrenia.
Yes.
Like if you say that I have my own religion, and that is nonsense. Only a few days ago I heard a certain Bella say that
don't mention these videos.
a certain person say to me that find the answers in yourself.
Yeah. It's
So
dangerous. I think that's a very dangerous advice. I think it's a horribly dangerous advice. And if you hear this, Bella, sorry. I've been doing that myself for decades. I realize by making oneself true, and I have to point it out once more, I'm so thankful to Dag Westerståhl for that, because we all got scared in the lecturing hall, and we said afterwards, but we couldn't put our fingers on it. But it sounded so eerie, so scary. This I really don't want. I did not know afterwards where to turn. That took a year or two for me. But the scare in itself made me look. It was a kick in my butt, and it made me start looking. This can't be the way. It's just too scary. And it sounded that like halfway into the mental hospital. Make yourself true, or private religion for that sake. Invent your own religion or your own epistemology. I would say epistemology also, like private religion or private language, is something completely internal. Because the get here problem is one more of those really scary examples. When it becomes so eerie that your hair starts standing on your arm. This actually happened to me when I had the get here problem. I thought, this is just scary. This is just weird.
Which problem?
It's called the get here problem, and it's together with brain in the vat one of the most important problems. Of course, with the hard problem, 3 problems within modern analytical philosophy. I say thank you very much, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.